Some people believe that being born into a wealthy and powerful family means a life of happiness and comfort. But for some, riches can't replace the warmth of love. This is the story of a young girl who had everything, except the one thing she needed most. Growing up in a grand house in Tyrone, Ireland, she was surrounded by wealth, but felt like a stranger in her own home. While others admired her privileged life, she longed for something far more valuable: love and belonging. Eleanor was born into one of the wealthiest and most respected families in Tyrone, Ireland. Her family had influence, servants, and a grand house that many could only dream of. But beneath the elegant lifestyle, something was missing: affection. Her parents, especially her father, had always wanted a son to carry on the family name. When Eleanor was born, they saw her as a disappointment rather than a blessing. She had an older sister, Margaret, who was 6 years older. Margaret was kind and loving, often taking care of Eleanor when their parents were too busy. But their time together was short-lived. When Eleanor was only 12, Margaret got married and moved away to Dublin with her new husband. The house, once filled with laughter and companionship, suddenly felt empty. Eleanor missed her sister terribly. She was the only one who ever showed her warmth, the only one who made her feel valued. Without her, Eleanor felt invisible. Her parents rarely spoke to her unless it was necessary, and they never showed any affection. She spent most of her days wandering through the large, quiet halls of their mansion, longing for someone who truly cared. Though she lived in luxury, she was lonelier than ever. Years passed, and Eleanor slowly adjusted to life without her sister. Though she still felt lonely, she found comfort in the hope that Margaret was happy in Dublin with her new husband. But that hope was shattered when an unexpected letter arrived. The letter was from Margaret's husband. His words were filled with concern. Margaret had fallen seriously ill, and she longed to return home to Tyrone. The news filled Eleanor with both worry and excitement. She hated the thought of her sister suffering, but the idea of seeing her again gave her a sense of relief she hadn't felt in years. Their father immediately arranged for Margaret to return. According to the letter, she and her husband would leave Dublin on Sunday and arrive in Tyrone on Tuesday evening. That Tuesday, Eleanor could barely sit still. Every passing hour felt longer than the last as she eagerly awaited her sister's arrival. When night fell, she and her father sat by the front door, listening for any sign of Margaret's carriage. Midnight came and went, but still there was no sign of her. Then, just as Eleanor was beginning to lose hope, she heard something in the distance, a faint, sorrowful cry. She ran to the door, heart pounding. "They're here!" she called to her father. He quickly joined her, and together they stepped outside into the dark night. The wind was still, the stars shining brightly overhead, yet the eerie cry came again, drifting through the silence. But there was nothing, no carriage, no travellers, no sign of Margaret or her husband. The night remained empty. Confused and unsettled, Eleanor and her father returned inside, a strange feeling of unease settling over them. The next morning, their worst fears were confirmed. A messenger arrived with devastating news. Margaret had died the night before. At exactly 1 a.m., the same time Eleanor and her father had heard the cries in the dark, Margaret had taken her final breath. Eleanor was shattered. It was as if her sister had reached out to them one last time before leaving this world. From that moment on, she would never forget the sound of that sorrowful cry, a haunting reminder of the sister she had lost forever. For 2 long years after her sister's death, Eleanor lived in deep sorrow. She withdrew from the world, spending most of her days in silence, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. But time moved on, and eventually, so did her mother. One day, her mother came to her with a plan. "We're going to Dublin," she said. "It's time for you to find a husband." Eleanor wasn't sure how to feel. Marriage was the last thing on her mind, but deep down, she knew she couldn't stay trapped in sadness forever. Dublin was a lively, bustling city, far different from the quiet countryside of Tyrone. There, she was introduced to high society, grand parties, elegant ballrooms, and an endless stream of wealthy suitors hoping to win her hand. At first, she resisted. None of the men truly interested her. They were either too proud, too dull, or too focused on her family's fortune. But then she met Lord Glenfallen. He was older than her by many years, but he was different from the others. He was not particularly handsome, yet he carried himself with quiet confidence. He spoke of literature, history, and philosophy, his words filled with intelligence and wisdom. Unlike the younger men who tried to impress her with empty compliments, Lord Glenfallen actually listened when she spoke. In his presence, Eleanor felt a sense of peace, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Still, she did not love him. One evening, her mother sat her down. "He is a good man, Eleanor. He comes from a respected family, and he can give you a life of comfort and stability. Love will come later." Eleanor was unsure, but she thought about her lonely childhood, her parents' coldness, and the emptiness she had felt since losing her sister. Lord Glenfallen was kind. He made her feel safe. Perhaps that was enough. The next morning she gave her answer. Yes, by spring, they were married. As she stood beside her husband, leaving Tyrone behind, she hoped she had made the right choice. She wanted to believe that happiness would follow, but deep inside, a quiet unease remained, whispering that her story was far from over. Eleanor had never seen a place as beautiful as Karilla. As she and Lord Glenfallen arrived at his grand estate, she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't expected. The house was surrounded by lush green fields, towering trees, and a peaceful river that sparkled under the golden sunlight. Birds chirped in the garden, and flowers of every colour swayed in the breeze. It felt like a dream, a fresh start, a home where she could finally be happy. Inside, the estate was even more breathtaking. The grand halls were lined with elegant paintings. The furniture was rich and luxurious, and the warmth of crackling fireplaces filled every room. Unlike the cold, distant atmosphere of her childhood home, Karilla was full of life. Servants bustled around with friendly smiles, and the housekeeper, an older woman named Martha, welcomed her warmly. "You'll love it here, madam," Martha said, as she led Eleanor through the house. "It's a good place, full of happy memories." But not everything in Karilla felt right. As Martha showed her to the bedroom, Eleanor stopped suddenly. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a large black coat. It was old and heavy, draped over a wooden stand, as if waiting for someone to wear it. Yet, something about it sent a chill down her spine. She stepped back. That coat. Where did it come from? Martha's face went pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, "You saw it?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, feeling uneasy. "Is there something wrong with it?" Martha hesitated before speaking. "In this house, we believe that when someone sees the black coat, misfortune follows." She swallowed hard. The last time it appeared, Lord Glenfallen's father died the very next morning. Eleanor shivered. Was it just an old superstition? Or was there truly something sinister about this house? She tried to push the thought away, reminding herself that she had married into a new life, one of stability and comfort. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Eleanor had begun settling into life at Karilla, embracing the beauty and warmth of her new home. But something still felt off. Her husband, once lively and engaging, had become increasingly quiet, his expressions shadowed by something she couldn't quite understand. At first, she thought it was simply the weight of his responsibilities, but soon she realized it was more than that. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Lord Glenfallen suddenly stopped. He turned to her, his usual gentle demeanour replaced by something cold and serious. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and firm, "there's something I need to tell you." She frowned. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing toward the grand estate behind them. "There are rooms in the back of the house that you must never enter. Promise me." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Just promise me." The way he looked at her, his sharp blue eyes filled with something close to fear, made her uneasy. She had never seen him like this before. "I don't understand," she said. "Is there something dangerous?" "It's not for you to understand," he said quickly. "Only know this. Some doors are better left closed." She nodded slowly, sensing there was no point in pressing him further. But the warning stayed with her. Why was her husband suddenly so strict about something he had never mentioned before? What could possibly be in those rooms? That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of his words. What was he hiding? And more importantly, how long could she resist the temptation to find out? Eleanor had spent the morning walking through the gardens, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet beauty of Karilla. After lunch, she decided to go upstairs to her room to rest before the evening. As she reached for the door handle, she hesitated. Something felt different. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, then froze. A woman sat in the chair by the fireplace. She was draped in a long black coat, her face pale as if all the blood had been drained from it. Her hands rested motionlessly in her lap, but the most unsettling thing was her eyes, clouded, empty, staring straight ahead. The woman was blind. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Who are you?" she managed to say, gripping the doorframe for support. The woman's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You must be the new Lady Glenfallen." Eleanor's heart pounded. "This is my room," she said firmly. "You shouldn't be here." The woman let out a cold laugh. "Your room," she mocked. "You're mistaken, my dear. This is my home, and I am the real Lady Glenfallen." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," she whispered. The woman's expression twisted into anger. "Did he not tell you?" she hissed. "Did he not mention that he already had a wife, that I was here long before you?" Eleanor shook her head, her mind racing. Was this a cruel joke, a mistake? Or was her husband hiding something far darker than she had imagined? Suddenly, the woman lunged forward, her cold fingers digging into Eleanor's arm. "You have no place here," she shrieked. Then, before Eleanor could react, a sharp slap landed across her face. Eleanor stumbled backward, gasping in shock. "Help!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the halls. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Within moments, the door burst open, and Lord Glenfallen rushed inside. His eyes locked onto the blind woman, his face contorted with a mix of fear and fury. Eleanor backed away, clutching her stinging cheek. "Who is she?" she demanded. But her husband didn't answer. Instead, his face went pale. He swallowed hard before muttering just one word: "Forget her." But Eleanor knew she never would. Eleanor's heart was still pounding from the encounter with the blind woman. The shock of the moment left her shaken, but what frightened her more was her husband's reaction. Lord Glenfallen stood in the doorway, his face pale and tense. He didn't yell, didn't rush to comfort her. He just stood there, as if frozen in fear. She turned to him, demanding answers. "Who is she? Why is she in my room? She claimed to be your wife." Lord Glenfallen's jaw tightened, but he refused to meet her gaze. "You must forget about her," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stepped closer, anger rising in her chest. "Forget her? How can I forget something like this? Tell me the truth, Glenn." But he shook his head, rubbing his hands together as if trying to rid himself of an unseen burden. "She's nothing, just a woman from the past. She doesn't matter." Eleanor wasn't convinced. His hands trembled. His usual confidence was gone. She had never seen him like this, like a man haunted. From that day forward, everything changed. Lord Glenfallen withdrew into himself, becoming more distant and restless. He barely spoke at dinner, staring into the fire for hours, lost in thought. He spent his nights pacing the halls, muttering under his breath. Eleanor could feel the tension thickening in the house, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Then, one morning over breakfast, he suddenly blurted out, "We must leave." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Leave? Where would we go?" "France or Spain, somewhere far from here," he said quickly, barely looking at her. "I'll arrange everything. We should go soon." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a casual suggestion. It was desperation. "Why?" she asked carefully. "Is it because of that woman?" He slammed his cup down, his eyes flashing with something close to panic. "I said forget about her, Eleanor. This is about us. We need a fresh start, away from this house." Eleanor stared at him, trying to read his face, but all she saw was fear. He was hiding something terrible. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with questions. Why was he so afraid? And more importantly, what was he running from? Eleanor had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep when something pulled her from her dreams. A presence, a shift in the air, the feeling of being watched. Her eyes fluttered open, and a cold chill ran down her spine. At the foot of her bed, a figure stood motionless. A dim light flickered from the candle in its hand, casting eerie shadows against the walls. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the darkness, her breath caught in her throat. It was her. The blind woman. Her pale, lifeless eyes stared forward, unfocused, but her body was rigid with purpose. In her free hand, she clutched a long, glinting knife. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs, but she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then, the woman spoke. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice dry and raspy, like dead leaves scraping against stone. "You are not his wife. I am." Eleanor's throat went dry. "That's not true," she managed to say, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. The woman took a step closer. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight. "If you stay here," she continued, tilting the knife slightly, "I will kill you. Leave this house tomorrow, or you will not live to see another night." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman turned and glided out of the room without a sound, disappearing into the shadows. Eleanor sat there, paralyzed, staring at the empty space where she had stood. The house was silent again, but the weight of the woman's words clung to her like a curse. She could not stay silent any longer. At dawn, she stormed into Lord Glenfallen's study, her hands trembling. "I need to know the truth," she demanded. "Who is she? What does she mean when she says she is your real wife?" Her husband's face went deathly pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't just afraid of the woman in the dark. She was afraid of the man she had married. Eleanor sat trembling in the dimly lit kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. Across from her, Martha, the old housekeeper, watched her carefully. The warmth that once filled Martha's blue eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and haunted. "You shouldn't have seen her," Martha whispered. "You shouldn't have spoken to her." Eleanor shivered. The memory of the blind woman's empty eyes and the glinting knife still haunted her. "Who is she?" she demanded. "She said she was his wife. She said I don't belong here." Martha inhaled sharply and looked away, as if weighing whether to tell the truth. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. "She was Lady Margaret Fallon," Martha said. "Your husband's first wife." Eleanor's stomach turned. "His first wife?" Martha nodded, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "Many years ago, she lived in this house just like you. She was young, beautiful and full of life. But then, she died." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "How?" she whispered. Martha hesitated, then lowered her voice. "No one knows for certain. One night a terrible scream was heard from the back of the house. By the time anyone arrived, Lady Margaret was dead, her body lying in a pool of blood. And her eyes—" Martha's voice faltered. Eleanor's throat tightened. "What about her eyes?" Martha swallowed hard. "They were gone." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Eleanor clutched her arms, her mind racing. "Some say it was an accident," Martha continued. "Others believe Lord Glenfallen had something to do with it." Eleanor's chest tightened. "You think he—" Martha shook her head. "I don't know what to believe, child, but ever since that night, she has never left this house. Her spirit lingers in the shadows, waiting. She appears to every new Lady Fallon as if to warn them or to claim them." Eleanor felt sick. The blind woman's chilling words echoed in her mind. "I am his wife. You are not." She suddenly realized She was not just living in her husband's house, she was living in the house of a ghost. Eleanor could no longer stay in that cursed house. Fear gripped her every night, and the presence of Lady Margaret's ghost was unbearable. She packed her bags in the early morning hours, her hands trembling as she stuffed clothes into a worn leather trunk. She didn't say goodbye to her husband. She didn't need to. He had become a stranger, consumed by secrets he refused to share. With the first light of dawn, she climbed into a carriage and left Karilla behind. As the wheels turned and the house faded into the distance, she felt an immense weight lifting from her chest. She was finally free. Back in Tyrone, Eleanor found comfort in the familiar walls of her childhood home. The air was quieter, and for the first time in months, she felt warmth and safety. Her parents, once distant and indifferent, welcomed her back with surprising kindness. She told no one the full truth about what had happened. Some things were too horrifying to speak aloud, but peace did not last. It started with whispers in the night. Then, shadows flickered in the corners of her room. And soon, the dreams came. In them, she saw her sister, her beloved sister, who had died so suddenly. She stood at the foot of Eleanor's bed, her face calm, but her eyes filled with warning. "She is still searching," her sister whispered. "She will never stop. The next Lady Fallon will suffer as you almost did." Eleanor would wake in cold sweats, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. The ghost of Lady Margaret was still out there, waiting for the next woman to fall into her trap. And Eleanor knew, no matter how far she ran, the curse of Karilla would never truly be behind her. Eleanor may have escaped Karilla, but the shadow of its dark past would never fade. The whispers in the night, the warnings from her sister, and the restless spirit of Lady Margaret were reminders that some secrets refuse to stay buried. This chilling story leaves us with one question. Was Eleanor truly safe? Or was she simply the next in line to be haunted? If you enjoyed this mysterious and haunting tale, remember that stories like these are not just for entertainment. They help you improve your English listening skills naturally. The more you listen, the more familiar English words, sentence structures, and pronunciation become. So don't stop here. Keep practicing with us every day. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to Daily English Listening, and ring the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Let's make English learning an exciting journey together. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.